Welcome, everyone. We are now on our third episode of the Marshall Way Network, and here we are with our council, sans one. We have one that's out today who's ill, but I'd like to do some introductions before we get into our third episode here. So first of all, I'll just start in order of who's going to speak today. First, we have Dr. Ronald Leach, who's a retired dentist, but he has a lot of experience in many different arts. He's a 9th Dan in Shorin-ryu karate. He's a 9th Dan in Taekwondo. He's a 6th Dan in Shurite, a 4th Dan in Kenjutsu and Iajutsu, and a 3rd Dan in Kyokushinkai. And then next up on our roster today is Mr. Corey Rose, who's a 2nd degree in Taekwondo, and he is the owner and chief instructor at Peaceful Warriors Martial Arts in Newcastle, Oklahoma. After Mr. Rose, we have Mr. Sam Roach. He is a 1st Dan in Kyokushinkai, and he is an international student who has lived in South Korea and traveled to Japan, and right now he's in the U.S., but he intends to travel back to probably South Korea as well. So lots of experience here. And then I myself, I am your host, and my name is Vishan Borich, and I hold a 5th Dan in Shorin-ryu karate, a 5th Dan in Kyokushinkai, and both Dr. Leach and myself run a dojo in Branson, Missouri. All right, so today's topic is really a good one. It's one that I've been wanting to do for a while, so I'm excited about it. And the topic is how to practice and train effectively to generate massive success in the martial arts. So with that said, I want to give one general housekeeping thing before we pass it on to Dr. Leach, our first speaker. And that is, you'll see below this video, there's an area for a chat. And because you're a part of our live show, you have the capability to chat in that window. You can ask us questions, and towards the end of the show, we'll try to answer those questions for you. So go ahead, get logged in. It's free to log in, and we look forward to your questions and comments. So we'll go ahead now and hand it over to Dr. Leach.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. We're going to talk about massive success. This is something I never really thought about success in karate, in the martial arts, as being massive. I've always had a very small school, and in actuality, we really don't achieve everything all at once. They're done in very small increments. Last time we talked about setting goals, and these are the things that help us succeed. But for me, my success came through personal practice. Classes in our system were always for teaching and learning. We then were able to practice techniques and learn techniques there, but we were expected to practice at home, and by doing that, then we were supposed to perfect our techniques in that way. But the most important thing in success, if you only practice in class and not at home, you miss all the mental gymnastics that goes through studying your art and trying to figure out exactly how you are supposed to be doing things. First of all, and for me, the most important thing was always kata. There's no easier way to keep really sharp in your techniques than to do kata. Kata in your system should bring out all of the techniques in that particular system. So as you get up in rank, you're doing more and more techniques, and you are developing more and more, and you stay sharp. But when I did kata, and I learned it in the Q level, I would first look at the foot pattern. After I kind of got the kata down, I go back and look at the foot pattern. That was most important. I had to start and stop at the same point. That's always necessary, at least in our system. So that footwork was most important. Once I could return to the same spot each time, then I would add the upper body techniques. First, adding it slowly so that I could coordinate the foot movements and the hand movements together. So the upper body techniques were added. Then I started to add power to that, and then to make it look more realistic. And then after the kata is completed, at that point, you have to add that internal strength. And really, the only way you get that internal strength in a kata is by doing it over and over and over. And then you've developed something. You've developed success in your kata. Okay. Now, you also in your kata need to expand your knowledge of that kata. First of all, you have to know the function of every technique and how it works. You have to visualize for every technique your opponent's reaction. What is going to happen to that person? Now, I know a lot of times we block and we punch. If we did that, we'd have a different body reaction, but our punch is always going to be to the same level. That's where it's assigned to be. But that probably is not the case in real life. If you were to punch, block somebody and punch them, the next technique that comes along in the kata may be something entirely different, and you don't have any follow through on that technique. So you need to think how these techniques will each expand. What happens after you punch? Is a punch just a punch? And my answer to that is no, it is not. There are punching extensions. There are extensions to every block and to every piece of every kata. There's an extension that goes with that is so important. That is the basis of developing your knowledge of the kata and knowing where it's going to go. You need to look at your blocks. Make sure that they're in the proper order. But what happens after that block? Where do we go with that? Nobody just blocks something. And if you do, you're in trouble. And if you do that in the real world, if you're just standing there and block, you're going to be a punching bag. And that can't be. After I've learned the kata and I've got everything down, I've got the internal power, the internal strength, then I like to play with it. And I like to do the kata fast. And sometimes I like to do the kata slowly. I mean, maybe about a quarter speed. And that really helps me to focus on the exactness of my techniques. And then I like to do a mix of them. Some things just beg to go fast. And some things just beg to go slower. And although that's not the way the kata is to be done, it still works well in my knowledge, in acquiring my knowledge of that kata, to understand that better. Now, that's the way I practice kata. Now, the second aspect of training for success is to approach the techniques that are given in your training. And I approach the techniques in a very similar manner, going to class first and just having good instruction, having the instructor teach you the particular technique, and then doing it with a partner in class. Now, when I go home, I start to take that apart, and then I check that footwork, and I make sure my footwork is there, because the footwork is most important aspect of the art. If you've got a good sound base, you're going to have good upper body techniques. If you have a weak base, you're going to have weak upper body techniques. So I work that out in the foot patterns. Then I visualize how this technique is going to work. What is going to happen as I do this particular technique? And then I visualize what is going to happen with the uke when I do this technique. If I'm grabbing a wrist or if I'm punching someplace, what is the effect on my opponent? What is going to happen to their body? I analyze it, I break it down, I put it all back together, and then I try to memorize the aspects of every technique for the level I'm working on, and then memorize all the techniques. This is necessary if you're going to go through a rank promotion. You have to know your information, and you have to be able to produce it. I also tell my students when they memorize to do it out loud, because if they can actually say it, they can probably do it. But if they can't say it, it's not in their brain. It doesn't work here, and they don't have the necessary information ready to do the technique. So when they can say it, they do it, and they do well that way. Now, you go back and you try it again with your partner, and all of a sudden, you look at it and say, well, did this work right? If not, why didn't it work? Was it my partner? Did he not, is he supposed to give me a high punch and I got a low punch? Or was it me? Did I add something into this, or did I see something in the technique that was not quite correct? And I practiced it in a way, in my brain it worked out, but in actuality it didn't work out. And this does happen. So in class then is when I needed to adjust these errors and make things work out. Once that's done, I return again to the private practice, and then I try to perfect this technique as much as I can. And I practice this technique mentally also, going through it in my mind, and working through each technique in my brain so that it is wired into my brain, and then I can do it and do it well. Then, just like in Kata, I love to play with techniques after I've learned them, and I recommend to my students they do that. Although they have to do the required technique for their promotional examination, I want them to change the techniques as they're practicing. I want them to change the footwork. Put the left foot forward instead of the right. What happens to the technique? Analyze it. What happens if you grab with the wrong hand or you block with the wrong hand? What are you going to do? What happens if you grab that hand and you twist it clockwise and you were supposed to twist it counterclockwise? I want them to see what happens with each variation. Generally speaking, these things will lead to another technique. As you develop in the martial arts, these techniques become very evident. When something presents itself, it's just there, begging to be taken, and as you advance, you learn to take those. If it leads to something else, that's fine, that's great. But what are you going to do if it doesn't lead to something else? Well, the important thing is if you know that something isn't going to work, you may avoid it. Or if it's not working that way, what can you do to recover to work? And then you learn these things over a long period of time. And these altered techniques then become available, and it makes your art that much more effective. It makes you a much more effective martial artist, and a much more successful martial artist. Eventually, with time, you see these openings, and you just naturally take it. So, to me, success only comes with two things. Number one, time, and number two, practice. So, that's about all I have, and I will turn it over to Mr. Rose.
All right, Dr. Leach, thank you. You made some amazing points, especially when you talk about playing with your form, playing with the techniques in your form. That's another thing we talk about in here, doing mirrored forms and things like that. Making a form your own, bringing your own rhythm into it, playing with the timing. Also, when it comes down to, as you were saying, a technique, when it comes to self-defense and joint lock and grip releases, things along those lines, it's another thing we always talk about here when we test for those stripes. So we do those testings for joint lock defense or grab defenses or something like that. The rule of the day is make it work. It doesn't have to be pretty at first, just make it work. And that's something I'm going to get into a little bit more with what I'm talking about. But the first place I'm going to start is, I think a lot of teachers understand this, that it's difficult to get people to really commit themselves to something that they're doing if it's not fun for them. in some form or fashion. Now, as teachers, a lot of us think about catering to kids and making things fun in order to cater to kids, but when's the last time you had fun as an adult too? I do a lot of our same fun drills with the kids. I'll turn around and do it with the adults too, because when's the last time as an adult that you got out and played in the way you did as a kid, and you get to running around and jumping and racing, and you're not realizing exactly how much that you're moving around. But at the same point in time, it's great to have fun, but there are times that you have to take it very seriously as well, or you're going to gain little to nothing. I've always been a huge proponent of positive reinforcement, so not so much hammering on people or kids or adults about getting something right. Sure, I'll tell them what they need to work on, but I start off by giving them a positive first, because I think we all have went through things in our life. We've all been good at something at some point or another. Maybe we're good at something now. What made us so good at it? It was probably because we enjoyed doing it and because we felt like we were pretty good at it the first couple times we tried. Now, the person showing it to us or teaching it to us at that time was probably thinking, oh man, this guy's terrible. But they still at least made us feel like we were doing good at it. So what did we do when we went home? We kept doing it. We kept practicing because we thought we were good at it. And in turn, we ended up getting better and better and better at it. So in my opinion, that's something that positive reinforcement can do for you. The thing about, I think I see a lot of people struggle with is when it comes down to traditional exercises or traditional drills, traditional practice, a lot of people just only want to go halfway, and they assume that that's enough, but they're not really ever pushing their limits in that case. So as individuals, we have to remember that if we are doing push-ups, or if we are doing sit-ups, or even if we are doing a blocking drill or a self-defense drill or traditional form in kata, that if we're not pushing our own limits of strength and cardio, our own mental and physical limits, then what are we really gaining in that regard? Now, when you're first learning something, of course, you're going to have to go slower. You're going to have to figure it out. You're going to have to play with it. But at the same time, there always comes a point where you've got to put it to a serious test too, and you've got to do so regularly. You've got to play with the techniques to make sure that they work. So I guess one of the things that we do when it comes to traditional exercise, because as an individual, if you're not putting everything you have into it, you really don't have anyone to blame but yourself when you're not seeing the results from it. It's hard to blame the teacher when they ask you to do something, but you only do half of what you're capable of. You're never going to push your boundaries. Others can try to help you, but only you can learn how to push past your limits. So it helps as a teacher, if there's any teachers listening, I think a lot of us know this, it helps to make any of the practice that maybe seems like the boring bits to most people into something a little bit more interesting, a challenge or a game. And I'm not saying just with the kids. You'd be amazed how well adults respond to this as well. I'll just throw this out there. A bouncy ball can make all kinds of fun games that seem like they may have nothing to do with martial arts at all. But 20 minutes later, you have no idea how much you've ran, how much strength stuff you've done, how much you've gained in cardio, because you've been having so much fun chasing a bouncy ball around. There's a lot of drills like that. Other things you can do, relay races, for example, challenges, other kinds of games, and have some kind of little incentive on it. I know my incentive is usually exercise, and I know that sounds funny, but it'll be something like the winning team gets 20 push-ups, but the losing team does 40. Or sometimes I'll wait till the game's over and I'll flip-flop that just to keep people on their toes, where the winning team gets 40, the losing team gets 20. One of the things I always say in class, and well, let me back up a little bit. When we're doing these relay races, one of the things that I like to do is use a basic technique or basic stances as part of the race. So not an exercise itself, but rather techniques on the bag, or maybe a self-defense segment or something along those lines, or stances, so that it's not the exercise that you're doing. You're actually doing practice in that, and then when you come back, you get your exercise at the end when it comes down to the incentive. The incentive of it, and then that way it makes doing some of the basics fun too, doing some of the stances fun and things along those lines. One of the things I always say in those cases to the teams that lose, you always get people, especially kids, oh, I keep being on the team that's losing, and my answer to that is, well, We can't all be the best at technique unless we practice, not just here, but at home, as Dr. Leach said. But we may not all be able to be the best at technique, but at least you might be the fastest or you might be the strongest by the time you're done doing all these exercises. And that counts for something too. Being fast, being strong, that counts for a lot as well as just having good technique. So as I said, bouncy balls, games, those kind of things can create all kinds of fun environments. Have you ever just taken a night and said, okay, tonight in classes, we're just going to have some fun. We're going to kind of, yeah, it's going to be martial arts related, but we're going to kind of throw out what we do on the traditional stuff tonight, and we're just going to play some games and get in shape in playing some games. It can be a good thing to do every once in a while. Dr. Leach kind of pointed this out a little bit ago. When you're first learning a technique, especially if it's something that involves a joint lock or involves a throw, also if it involves striking, but we go through what we call the cooperation phase. So when you're with your partner, you want to make sure that you're cooperating so that you both get the idea of exactly how the technique's supposed to work, the idea of the angles, the footwork, kind of how it's supposed to go. But the thing is if you always stay somewhat in that cooperation phase, then you never really put your technique to the test at all. So once we go through the cooperation phase, I always promote with my students that they take it home. So even if it's something you do with a partner, as Dr. Leach said, doesn't mean you have to have a partner to do it. I like to do things in a mirror, but you don't even have to have a mirror. Say you just pretend somebody grabbed you, pretend somebody's throwing that punch, and just react how you would have done with a partner. And for you guys out there, anyone listening that might be involved in doing creative form or extreme form, weapon or non-weapon or any of that, one of the things I always bring up with our students that do that too is you can use those same self-defenses in your form. If you learn how to do it without a partner, you can use the same footwork, the same steps, the same hand techniques, and you'd be surprised how cool it looks in the middle of a creative or extreme form. But every once in a while, we need to be pushed. So I always say to my students, once you have the technique down, you and your partner both, and your partner, you're partnered up that particular day with someone that is about the same size, about the same weight as you are, then it's time to start pushing each other a little bit. At first, not necessarily just fighting back, but just resisting, holding back. So say it's a trip or something like that, not just falling with it, but making them really have to trip you, making them really have to make it work. And then we lead into that. By the time we're testing for our stripe on, say, a self-defense or something along those lines, then we go a little bit harder. So when it comes down to when we do a rank advancement, a belt testing, rank advancement, we kind of go back, and we go back into cooperation mode when it comes to self-defenses, whether striking or not striking. But when the stripe test comes along, so it's in class, we do our stripe test in class, when that comes along, and say we're doing basically a self-defense or joint lock segments, then we will get everybody on one side of the room, and you're doing your testing, and you're kind of in the middle of the ring, and you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. At black belts, we send 6 at a time, and they're going to come in at you with whatever, at black belts, we use whatever attacks they want to, and black belts will mix striking into it and things like that. And the color belts, we stick away from striking in a lot of the self-defense segments just for safety purposes. But they'll come at you, and they will grab you, and they will grab you hard, and they will try to drag you off. And if you get drugged to the edge of the ring, lost your testing. You can try next class. The whole point is to make it work, even if it's not pretty, even if the technique doesn't come out pretty, even if the technique's not exactly what we've been working on in class. The name of the game that day is make it work and get away, because ultimately, is that not what self-defense is really all about? So we go through that, so we have those times that we really test ourselves. Now, when we're using striking involved in those self-defense segments, like what we personally do with the black belts, then we expect control to be shown. We expect the techniques to be thrown much as you would in 1-step or 3-step sparring, and we kind of expect the attackers to at least pretend a little bit like they got hit. And I say, if you're the attacker and you don't pretend you got hit, next time they're really going to hit you. That's just how it's going to go. But every once in a while, you got to be tested to make sure these things are actually going to work. Make sure these things are going to work for you. Techniques sometimes don't work for specific people of specific builds against people of other builds. I always like to trade partners. Yes, I'll make someone my size. I'm only 5'8". I will make someone my size go against somebody, 6'5", to make sure they can make it work there. Then I'll make them go against somebody maybe their own height but that has 100 pounds on them. Can they make it work there? And then what usually ends up surprisingly being the ultimate test, Can they do it to somebody smaller than them? It's surprisingly hard to do a lot of trips and throws and techniques to someone smaller than you. That quick footwork they have can often throw you off. So make sure you're actually putting a little bit of time in to practice your techniques as hard as possible, as safely as possible. Now right here I'm talking more grappling and joint lock type stuff. Sparring works that way too. I'll get a little bit more on that in just a second. But every once in a while, like I say, you want to get with a partner who's going to push you, who's going to struggle hard against you. If you're always only doing things with your partner halfway, then let's say you actually need that on the street someday. Somebody actually grabs you this way, and that's the first technique that comes to mind. One, you may remember the technique, you may start to do it, but your body's only used to going halfway through it, so you don't put the strength into it that's really needed on the street. Or you've never played with, well, if I go try to do it this way, I try to do this technique this way, and I lose the angle, then can I adjust to another technique? If you've never played with it hard, then you don't know if you have that capability of adjusting from one to another. And that's another reason, I don't know how many schools out there listening do lock flows. I really enjoy doing lock flow practice because it really teaches you to go from one technique to another, and to another when things aren't going necessarily your way. Now, that being said, these kind of things should always be done as safely as possible. So when it comes down to attackers for these testings, I always make sure that the attackers are people who are not going to absolutely hurt the person that's on the floor. They're just going to push them. And I make sure they're people that can take it if they get thrown a little hard or they accidentally get tagged a little hard. And then, you know, to bring that into sparring, I know sparring's a big issue with that because there's a lot of safety issues with sparring, and I am very, very safety-oriented when it comes to sparring. But at the same time, based on depending the type of class, it's also important to kind of know what it's like to get tagged a little hard and to get knocked around a little bit. I read an interesting blog the other day about some of the best lessons. It was from a black belt, and it's talking about some of the best lessons he learned were from getting beat up a little bit. We're doing women's self-defense classes and letting them just beat the tar out of them so that they gain confidence in their abilities, and the lessons that can be learned from that. And it's true, there are lessons that can be learned, a lot of lessons that can be learned from that. So I'm not saying spar hard all the time. I'm not saying don't have fun with it. What I am saying is when you're in the sparring ring, even if you're just supposed to go half speed for the particular drill or practice, make sure you're taking it very, very seriously, and you're not just kind of halfway going through it and laughing about it the whole time. But you're in that moment, you're actually trying to make it work. Not going full force on the strike, but I always tell my guys, full speed, low force. Now, someone steps into things every once in a while, and those things can happen. And then every once in a great while, we step away from that, and we kind of will put somebody, if they're scared of getting tagged themselves, we'll put somebody with someone who's not scared of getting tagged and let them go hard so they get the idea what it feels like. And through sparring practice, even in the safest practice, you're going to get hit hard every now and then. And then you're going to get a feel for it, and you're going to kind of go, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But make absolutely sure when it comes to strike, anything that involves striking or sparring practice, especially, that you have everybody using the proper safety gear. Gloves and foot pads in our style, for example, using a lot of kicks, are an absolute must-have when it comes down to striking, even if you're not planning on doing any hard striking. Now, we don't wear that stuff when we do one-steps, but the intention is not to hit our partner at all. But we do make sure we wear that stuff if there could be any accidental contact at all. And make sure that your gear that you're using for safety is approved. I mean, when it comes down to it, I see a lot of guys that want to try to work out just with, like, say, Olympic-style gloves. Olympic-style gloves have no padding. You might as well be going bare-knuckle with each other. So make sure you have some actual safety gear on when you're doing contact. But for the end of what I'm trying to say is, make sure you have fun with what you're doing. Make sure you try to make everything fun. Sparring can be fun. In my opinion, forms can be very fun when you start playing with them. Self-defense can be extremely fun. Grappling can be extremely fun. Have fun with it. As a teacher, make it fun. But make sure that everybody is going serious about it. Use incentives if you have to make sure that everybody's going full force. And I think most of us struggle with this when it comes to traditional exercises, push-ups, sit-ups, and those kind of things. Make races out of them. Make incentives to get people to try to mentally push themselves beyond their boundaries. That kind of stuff is what's going to help you make leaps and bounds. If you only ever practice everything halfway, you're only ever going to improve up to that point. You're never going to see what your true potential can be. And I wrote a blog not long ago. It's on the Marshall Way Network about, using, bringing the technique into your mind, teaching it to your body, and then being able to get your mind and body to communicate with each other, putting it into the wisdom of the body. So even if the mind can't keep up, the body can. And part of that is putting yourself in fast-paced situations that will push your adrenaline and things like that. I'm not going to get too deep on that subject. Instead, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Roach, who I believe is going to be speaking on mental aspects of training and how they affect your day-to-day.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey. I appreciate that very much. And I really like what you said about putting your whole heart into it. Putting 100% of your effort into what you're doing, and at the same time having fun with that. I agree with you there. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, in terms of the mental aspect of training, a lot of that comes down to just what you were saying. You have to go into it 100%. If you go into it with all your heart, all of your mind, all of your body, right, then you can train effectively. And I want to zero in on this word, effectively, because I think that the mental aspect really comes into martial arts when we talk about being effective and training in an effective way. If your mind is not there, then your body can't work at its optimum level. If your mind is not present in your practice, then you're not going to get very far, and you're certainly not going to improve nearly as much as you can. One of the things that I came across, well, actually, Dr. Leach and I came across at a bookstore recently, is the quote, "The mind, like a parachute, functions only when open." So I think that this also reflects the beginner's mind, that when we go into the dojo, we have an open mind to see what we can learn, what there is to be learned, and also to be open to whatever kinds of experience come our way. Now, I am a very, very adamant fan of meditation. So before I exercise, before I do any kind of training myself, I always take at least a few minutes to meditate. And I think that this is really where the mental edge comes in. It allows you to tune your mind, sort of like a musical instrument. If you have a musical instrument like a violin and you don't tune it, then you're not going to get a sound out of it that you want. You're not going to get a crisp and clear sound out of it. So I feel like if I go in and I train without doing any kind of mental preparation or having the right mindset, then a lot of my training is wasted. Now, I know that we want to use our time effectively as well, and in using our time effectively, that mental aspect comes right into play. Now, if I'm going to train for 30 minutes, then I might spend 10 minutes of that time in meditation, getting my mind ready for that next time period. When I first went into the martial arts, I started and I thought the idea was to go fast and hard all the time. So that's what I did. I put everything I had into it. I put all of my energy into it, and I found out that I'm too tense. I'm not relaxed enough. But I tried to go fast and hard all the time. And one of the results of that was that I started to get tunnel vision and this kind of tunneling in, and I think that that really was a detriment to my training in a lot of ways, because you don't want to get that kind of a mindset. The Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Cooper has a color code for psychological states of awareness and readiness when in battle. And he color codes them. So white is the state of being psychologically unaware or unready for any kind of a threat that's coming. And yellow is sort of a moderate level. Your heart rate is the same, is pretty even, but you're aware that there could be danger. You're aware that you're aware of your surroundings. Then there's orange, where your heart starts to beat a little faster, and you're getting a little bit tense, and you start to focus in on one specific threat. And then there's red, which is the lethal mode or the kill zone, where you're just really zoned in completely, and all of your other thinking is just gone, and you're ready to kill or do what needs to be done to get out of the situation. Now, the orange level and the red level, in terms of states of awareness, that's not the optimal state to be in. I think the optimal state to be in is the yellow state, the one where physically you are relaxed, but your mind is aware and your mind is sharp. And this translates into all kinds of different situations in our life. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, an expert on a lot of these things, but I do try to be mindful, and I do try to practice a lot of these things in my daily life. I try to notice when I'm starting to zone out, when I'm starting to not pay attention, and bring my mind back very quickly. So when you enter a room, when you go into doors, when you open a door, I think that is also another time when you can sort of remind yourself to be mindful. You step into that room and you remind yourself that you're here, and you let go of whatever is in your mind that's distracting you from that present moment. And I think that translates when you come into the dojo. You leave everything outside. You bow, you do a little bit of meditation, and you leave all the extra garbage outside. And after you focus on what you're going to do, you're much more prepared to train effectively, to put your all into what you're doing. I've walked into clubs and bar settings, and one of the things that makes me a little bit edgy every time I go into a situation like that is if you walk into a club, there's strobe lights, there's loud music, there's tons of people, and there's no way that you could be aware of everything that's going on. So in those situations, I try to find a space where I don't have to be in the middle of everything, and just kind of where I can sort of be at a safe distance, because I think that if you combine a lot of drunk people and dancing and strobe lights and craziness, then it's a recipe for disaster. You have danger walking about every minute. And moving on from mental focus, I want to talk a little bit about a sense of gratitude. Having a sense of gratitude that I think is very important. I actually just watched on the NHK World, Alex Bennett had an interview with them, and he is a kendo instructor. And one of the things that he mentioned was a Japanese phrase that they use in kendo, which is utte hansei, utarete kansha. So that means utte is strike. So strike and hansei, reflect. Strike and reflect. Utarete kansha. When you get struck, be grateful. So I think that this is a hard lesson to learn for a lot of people, but the key here is that even if I get in on someone, even if I am able to strike someone, I don't gloat about it. I don't get arrogant and, oh yeah, I just got a point in, or anything like that. In fact, I reflect on it. I think about it, not maybe in that moment, but after the match is over, I reflect on why did that get in, and how could I have done that better even. And then utarite kansha, when I get struck, to be grateful, because that person is showing me a weakness. That person is showing me something that I'm doing that is not correct. So in judo, you get thrown all the time, and you have to get back up. And if you get angry about it, then you lose the lesson. You start to lose the lesson that can be learned in that situation. And also, I wanted to talk a little bit about an experience to kind of bring this all together. I studied judo for just a very short period of time. For about 3 months, I had the opportunity to study in Seoul National University and joined their judo club. And then I also went with them to a competition, and I competed. And the guy next to me, before we went into the ring, was visibly shaking. I could tell that he was an athlete because he was built. His body was, I mean, he had muscles. And he was visibly shaking. But I was the opposite. I think I was too calm. I was too relaxed. And we went into that ring, and he got me, threw me down in under a minute. And it was, on the one hand, it was mildly humbling to do that, but also I think it showed me a lesson in mental awareness, that he had a lot of energy, and he was able to channel that and focus it and use it. But my mind had become too relaxed, and I wasn't being aware and present in that moment. So as a result, I lost the bout. So when we're in the dojo and when we're outside of the dojo, all of these things kind of flow together. The mentality that we bring into the dojo is the mentality that we carry with us through our life when we leave. And when we come back, we carry all of the things that are outside back in. So this sort of sense of continuity is very important to have, and I think it's very key to understand where martial arts and life connect. So I would like to end with the thought, the very common thought among martial artists, that everywhere is a dojo, and that our mentality that we have in the dojo should be the mentality that we have in everyday life. And then with that, I will go back over to Sensei Boric here.
Thanks, Mr. Roach. I appreciate that. It's hard to follow when you have such incredible speakers that go ahead of you, and just to listen. And I took some notes again. What's beautiful is that the longer you do the martial arts, the more you realize you have so much more to learn. And I think it's so neat to do that. And so I learned not only from other martial artists who have black belt or higher, but I also learn from even the brand new students that come into the dojo. And so it's a blessing, and I have a lot of gratitude for that. So what you've heard up until this point has mainly been focused on mindset. I don't know if you've noticed that. A lot of it is the mental mindset, because in order to be a good martial artist and to have success in the martial arts, it does require a certain mindset and motivation to practice. because one of the things that you'll find, and you can tell if any of you are instructors who are watching this today, or if you're a student, you can tell in a class who's been practicing and training outside of class and who hasn't. And it's very easy to tell usually. And a lot of times as students you think, oh, they don't know that I haven't practiced. Well, yeah, your instructor knows. They can tell. So really it comes down to you and what is it that you want out of your martial arts training. And so I'm going to take it to a different direction. I'm actually going to give you some very specific techniques and tips that you might want to incorporate into your practice outside of your training hall. Be it that you call it a dojo or dojang or whatever it is that you're training in, you can take some of these techniques and use them when you're practicing outside. So in order to, and I'm getting my notebook here because I have a lot of notes on it, I'm going to start with kata or forms. Depending on the art that you're studying, you may call it either or. So one of the things that I think Dr. Leach brought up initially was kata is like a microcosm of everything that you've learned in the martial arts. And it's one of the, in my opinion, one of the easiest ways that you can practice and continue to improve on your technique without having a partner there. Now, I don't want to say that you don't want to just do the martial arts without ever working with a partner. There is room for both. In fact, you need both in order to improve. But sometimes it's just not practical. And so when you're practicing by yourself, and if you don't have somebody to work with, definitely, in my case, I focus on kata and forms. So maybe you've learned several forms, and in doing those, you feel like you know them really well, and you're bored with them because you know them and you've been doing them for so long. So here's what you do when you get to that point where you're kind of bored and you're not so sure how to practice so that you reinvigorate your training. So here's what I wrote down is, number one, you can practice your kata, and I'm going to kind of interchange the words back and forth here, but you can practice your kata fast, like as fast as you possibly can, until you almost burn out, without, see how fast you can do it without breaking down the actual techniques that are in the kata. So that's one way to go through your kata. The second thing is then to try it again, doing it as slowly as you possibly can. Imagining for a moment that you're in a pool of molasses in January, and you're trying to do your form in super slow motion. You'll be amazed at what you find out when you do something really slow, if you're actually doing it in the proper way. So that's another way. The other thing is to take your kata and do it in mirror image. All right, you're saying, well, how do you do that? Well, basically, you are doing it the reverse of how you normally do your kata. And in doing it that way, it causes your mind to rethink your stepping and rethink your punches, rethink your kicks, rethink how you move in your stances. And by doing that, it really adds to your kata, and you're going to begin to know that kata so well that you can do it with anything going on around you. The other thing that you can do, if you excuse me, I'm hesitating here, outside of that is the reverse. Reverse is different than mirror image. In reverse, you go to the very end of the kata, and then you go back to the second to last move, and then the third to last move, and you go through it as if you were looking at a video and hitting the rewind button and going through it that way. And by doing it that way, you quickly start to realize where your turns are off a little bit and where you can improve those. And it's really challenging to go through it that way. The other thing I want to say, and especially in regards to kata and forms, is you literally can practice these anywhere. I used to travel a lot more than I do now, but I still like to travel. But I used to travel a lot for my previous job, and I was gone for sometimes 2 weeks at a time in a month, and so I couldn't get into the dojo. And the only place I really had to practice was in a hotel room. And you learn how to be really creative in practicing your kata in a very small space in a hotel room. And you learn how to shuffle your feet and be able to do the whole kata. And for me, it actually improved my kata because I got to the point with some of my katas, not all of them yet, but with some of my katas where later on, if I was in, the actual dojo, I could be doing my kata, somebody could interrupt me in the middle of my kata, and I could still continue right where I left off without even thinking about it. Okay? When you can reach that point in your training, you know your kata. And here's another thing. Count out your steps when you're doing your kata. So count them out so you know where each one is, and then ask somebody to call off a random number and see if you can start from that point in your kata and complete the rest of it. And if you can do that, then you have definitely gotten to know that kata intimately enough so that you can become an expert at that particular kata. All right, so that's kata. I want to also talk about sparring. So how do you improve in sparring, especially if you're on your own and you don't have a sparring partner that you can work with? So I'm going to give you a few ideas that you can do that'll help you with your sparring. So one thing that you can do, and for me, sparring, some of the best sparrers or fighters that I've ever seen have some of the best footwork. And I don't know if you're into boxing or anything like that, watch their footwork. Watch how they move around their opponent. So if you're having trouble in sparring, with a partner, you may just need to work on your footwork. And one of the ways that I would work on my footwork is I would place things around on the floor. And again, like going back to a hotel room, if you're in a small space and you don't have a big space to practice, it's easy because you might have furniture that's in the way. And pretend that each thing that's in your way is an opponent. And then try to figure out the quickest way to get around them with your feet. And by quickest, this would be the least amount of steps with the least amount of physical energy to get around them. And if you can get around it in one step versus two, or spin around it quickly with just pivoting without actually taking a step, now you're on to something. Mark these things down, and now you're going to have some incredible footwork, which is going to help you tremendously when you start sparring with a partner again. Some other things that you can do in regards to sparring is really focus on combinations. I think a lot of times we get really good at certain punches, certain strikes, certain kicks and blocks, but until you have a combination that you just know by heart, or several of them, it's hard to really put it together when you're in the heat of a match. But if you've been practicing at least a three-step combination enough so that it's committed to memory, when you're in the heat of a match, you're going to see the opening and it's just going to come out. And for me, I think if you have 3 or more moves in a combination, you're going to have much more success in getting something in than if you just go in and strike once and then back out. So, try to get, in most schools they teach you combinations, but if yours doesn't, come up with 2 or 3 or 4 techniques that you can do quickly and that bring people's hands up and down and, moves them all over. If you're just going to the same spot 3 times, it's not going to be as effective in a combination as if you go to multiple spots on that person's body. So work through that, and that is another great way that you can practice. Obviously, with sparring, one of the best ways to get better is to practice with somebody else and different people, not always the same person. But another thing you can do if you just don't have somebody to practice with at this moment in time or when you're working out at home is that you can pull up videos. You can go out online, pull up videos of people sparring. Look at people that are experienced. Watch how they move. Watch their techniques. Watch their footwork. And watch where their hands are. Watch their body. Are they relaxed? Are they tight? What are they doing? And take notes and see if you can incorporate some of those things into yourself when you're sparring. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about in regards to tips for practicing is how often should you practice? When you're outside of your class time, how often should you go and practice on your own? Well, here's a general rule of thumb that's helped me, and that is if you are training and you are so sore after a day of training or you're injured that you can barely move, then you're training too hard. You're overtraining, Okay? Now, I know there's going to be occasions in which you're going to feel that because you've had a really hard workout, but your body needs to rest. And if you overtrain to a point where you're always sore and you always are strained in some spot, or you've got joints that ache or whatever, then you're training too hard, and you're possibly going to injure yourself further. So that's one kind of gauge to know if you're training too hard. The second gauge is if you're not training enough. The way you know you're not training enough is if you have not sweat at least 2 days in 1 week. Okay, if you have not had any type of sweat or perspiration for at least 2 days in a week, then you're probably not training enough. You really need to get your heart rate up. You need to do something that's going to, help you to get better at your art. And so you need to find a happy medium. I've seen a lot of different things on this, and even some of my old martial arts books, they said that even the masters from years ago, they recommended no more than 4 training days a week because they really felt like it was important for your body to rest and to heal. But again, you have to judge your body, and that comes back to what Mr. Roach said about meditating before you train. Feel your body when you're meditating. I mean, focus on your breathing and clearing your mind, but also listen to your body. What does your body need in that moment? Are your legs feeling weak? Do you need to work your legs? Are your arms feeling weak? Do you need to work your arms with different hand motions? Feel how you feel. If you're sore in spots, then maybe give that part of your body a rest so it can heal, so that you can get better in some of the other areas. So these are just general tips. Take what you like and leave the rest, as we like to say. But I hope that all of the things that we spoke of today, that you can get a little bit out of it and help you so that you can have maybe not massive success, but a lot more success than maybe you're experiencing right now by utilizing some of the tips from everyone that's here. So I'm going to check really quickly to see if we have any comments. If you didn't hear at the beginning of the call, we do encourage you to log in if you're watching the live call. You can even log in if you're watching this as a recording, and you'll see below there's an area where you can post comments or questions. If you post anything there, we will answer them on the live call. Otherwise, we'll try to answer them by texting later on. I'm not seeing anything in there right now, but I did want to say to you guys, if there's anything more that the rest of you would like to talk about, I'm going to open up the floor now to the rest of our panelists. Dr. Leach, I heard you say something.
I got an email. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? From Karate Girl, who
yes.
said she could not find the panel that you were talking about. We'll have to check that out. And if she has a question, why doesn't she email it back to us, and we'll answer it for our email.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. If somebody wants to email it, that's perfectly acceptable as well. Thank you.
I did want to mention one thing that I think should be mentioned, and that is that training outside in nature is a huge asset.
Oh, yeah.
Right now it's winter, and I'll tell you, if you put your feet in that snow, your mind wants to go back in real fast. But I find that in training in nature, you have the mental aspect, and you have a very sort of physical challenge, depending on whether it's summer and you're out in the heat, if it's winter and you're in the cold. And you can learn so much just from being outside in nature, working on an incline, working on a rough surface, a smooth surface, a slippery surface. And I think that particularly being in nature helps to develop tamashii, like a kind of spirit. So I would recommend that 100%, partially also because back in the day, way back when everything started, people practiced outside all the time. In fact, some martial arts were practiced exclusively outside. for a long period of time.
Great advice. Mr. Rose, did you have anything else to add?
Yes, and this one's really quick. I was going to add on to something Mr. Oates said earlier that's a huge thing for me. Speed counts twice as much as mass when it comes to power. And the key to speed is just staying relaxed. If you don't believe me, look up the math equation. But speed is twice as effective in generating power as mass is. And I'll just end with the quote I used to tell my students all the time. This is something I wrote down in the journal, so I don't know if someone else said this first or if I can actually attribute this to myself. But relaxation is the key to patience. Patience is the key to mastery. We have to slow down and look twice before we do things. In this way, the circles we run become the lines that we walk.
Very nice. Well, thank you, Mr. Rose, on that. I think we'll wrap up for the evening. Thank you all for coming out and watching our third episode. Our next episode is scheduled for Friday, March the 13th, same time, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll be sending out email alerts on that, so be checking your inbox. And have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everyone.